What was the initial attraction for you to the guitar growing up?
I guess it was rock and roll that I heard when rock and roll was first born in 1954. I was 13 years old, just turned teenager. That was a fluke in time right there, perfect timing. And I grew up in Toronto, in Canada, and the first rock and roll we heard on the radio, as kids came from American stations that were just over the border in Buffalo, New York, and Detroit. And at that time, I'd been studying piano at the privately, and I was studying trombone at the Royal Conservatory in Toronto. And I was only 13 and stuff, but I don't know, when I heard the very early recordings of Bill Haley and Chuck Berry, the first thing that was on the charts, which was essentially rhythm and blues more than anything, and Bo Diddley and that stuff in 54, 55, that did it. I had a neighborhood friend, a high school friend, who had a guitar and never played it, so I was going over there and borrowing his guitar and taking it back to my parents' house and just playing every minute I could spare, and within 6 months I was in a little local rock and roll band playing gigs, not for money, but that came about a year later.
And as you began playing, who were some of the guitar players that were starting to influence the style you were taking up?
Well, whoever was on the radio at the time, because I had absolutely, as a 13-year-old in 1954, I mean, we didn't have nearly, the access to pop music and the history of pop music that kids do now, and stuff. So that was my only exposure. So the guys that were on the charts in those first 2 years guitar players were mostly Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, the guitar player, whoever played the solo and Rock Around the Clock in Bill Haley's band, and Scotty Moore. I think Elvis got his first hit in 55. James Burton, who was playing with Ricky Nelson. Just whoever was on the charts.
One of the first times we got to hear your name was during your time with Ian and Sylvia and the Great Speckled Bird. How did that all come to be, and how do you look back on that time now?
Well, as I say, I grew up in Toronto, and Ian Tyson and Sylvia Tyson developed their career as young performers in Toronto. Sylvia was from a small town in Ontario, and Ian was from British Columbia, but he's studying art, I think, at the University of Toronto, and they started singing together, and they'd become a very popular acoustic act by about 1962 or 3. They were signed to a management company in New York, and signed with Albert Grossman, and they were very popular on the folk circuit. And around I guess it was late 67, early 68, Ian and Sylvia sort of came up with the idea of going electric and forming a small group that would essentially play country music, but with a sort of a heavier hitting rhythm section than it had ever been heard in the history of country music. And so it was really the prototypical country rock band, really. And Ian had heard me playing in local bands in Toronto at that time, and liked my playing, and called me up and told me of his concept, and I was really interested in doing it. It was a great chance for me, and it was really the first time I started to tour outside of Southern Ontario, or in the province that Toronto's in, and I started working in the States. It was a very exciting time.
Did you feel at the time that it was in a way, a trailblazing kind of outfit, that it was charting new musical territory?
Absolutely. That record didn't sell a whole lot of numbers, but it came out right around the same time that the Byrds' "Sweetheart of the Rodeo" came out, and the Byrds had also sort of simultaneously come up with a similar idea in terms of country rock, and I mean I knew it was a prototypical situation for sure, at least for those two bands, and it spawned a lot of other groups as well.
Oh, for sure. Your time working with the stable of artists at Bearsville Records, that must have been a magical period. Any standout memories there?
Oh yeah, lots of them. I mean, I moved there in about 1970 after about 2 years. It was during that time period that my style started to surface. I mean, I invented a concept of sort of bending more than one string, a sort of a multiple glissandos, 2 and 3 strings at a time manually. Clarence White was doing the same thing, but using mechanical pedal steel devices inside a Telecaster with the Byrds. But I initially did that to because I was playing with a pedal steel guitar player for the first time with Buddy Cage, and I thought it would be nice if I could double or harmonize some of those pedal guitar figures. But I realized that or at least I discovered that what I was doing worked in other types of music too, and I went to Woodstock to join a band with Jeff and Maria Moldar, who were signed to Warner Brothers, and who played a real variety of roots music styles, and I thought it was something that would develop my playing better than playing strictly in a country rock band. And while I was there, Albert opened the Bearsville Sound Studios, and there was a smattering of recording sessions available there, and with Bearsville artists as well that didn't record in Woodstock. Like Jesse Winchester, who couldn't because he was on the lam from the draft board and was living in Montreal. So I remember going up to Canada, back to Canada to record with Jesse a lot, and the Bobby Charles album stands out as something really special. I still listen to it occasionally, and it holds up. And those two early Jeff and Maria albums were interesting. They still hold up for me. And then eventually, of course, when I started to play with Butterfield, the Better Days albums stand out in that period.
Absolutely. I get the feeling there was a real communal spirit amongst the artists there at Woodstock as well.
Not really.
No?
Bit of a myth. In fact, a lot of the bands there, it was a very short period, too. You have to remember, I mean, it was only about 3 years that sort of group of artists remained in that area. But even initially, the first people that moved up there were very reclusive in Dylan and the band, and they they went up there to get away from the music scene and isolate themselves somewhere where they could write and develop albums and album material. And I think that spirit continued as various bands and artists moved into the area. Most of them moved there because Albert was there, Albert Grossman, and Albert was looked on as having kind of the Midas touch, and the word got out that he was building a recording studio up there, and a lot of people moved there just hoped that some of that Albert magic could rub off on them, and as well as the acts that Albert actually managed, and several of the acts that he managed wanted to live, in that area, and because that's where Albert was living, and there was a studio there. But it wasn't the community that you might imagine.
Through your years as a studio player, how important was it for you to have a particular affinity with the artist that you were going to be playing with beforehand?
I can't say that that's ever been that important. I think it's really nice if you you really admire the artist's work, and talent. I mean, you don't even have to know them personally. A lot of times you just show up at a studio and you're performing with a complete stranger. It's probably more important for you to have affinity with the material itself, with the song, with something that you really like and something that suits your style, and consequently is something that you can really contribute something unique to.
Have you had any memories of any nightmare sessions that just didn't work for you at all?
There have been plenty of them, and I erase the memory as quickly as I can. Yeah. I guess it's sort of like a professional athlete, who has a lousy day on the pitch. You just want to forget about it and go out and win the next one.
During your session years, did you always harbour ambitions to end up recording for yourself?
Yes, I did the entire time on my entire musical career, and I kept getting these great jobs. Work not so much as a session player, but working in some really great bands. And I had about a 12-year period, I'd say, from about 1968 to about 76, really. It was about an 18-year period where I was in three very successful groups between the Ian and Sylvia band and working with Butterfield in the Better Days band, and then being Maria Muldar's band leader, where they were great jobs and I loved it, but I was playing guitar in every case for singers, for lead singers, and so that it totally eliminated any opportunity that I could have to sing. And when I wanted to make my own records, I wanted to be making them as a vocalist as well. So I basically had to start my own band in order to do that, and quit taking jobs strictly as a guitar player, which is what I did in about 1980.
Do you think having been a session player yourself in the past has helped you in these later years in terms of relating to your own band members?
No, I don't see the relationship. It's very, very different. It's especially as being a band leader. I had a lot to learn, and I made a lot of mistakes. And it's so different from being a sideman too in a group. And there's a lot more. It's a lot more work and a lot more responsibility, and there's a lot of aspects to it that you don't even think about when you work as a sideman or just as a single contracted session player. And you kind of have to learn the hard way sometimes, I think, before things get running smoothly.
You've been with Stony Plain Records for quite a long while now. Do they give you pretty much a free rein to try and do what you want on record?
Yeah, they've been great. Like that, Holger Peterson's a really good friend of mine, as well as my manager. And Holger always, wants to know what I want to do first, and I give him as much input as possible. But I conceptualize my own records in the long run, but I really value his opinion.
Is there a style or a type of album you've still got up your sleeve that you haven't tackled yet that you'd like to try?
Yeah, several. And in fact, I've been immersing myself a bit in mainstream jazz over the last year or so. I mean, I've always liked it, but I never really understood it. I have a very good background in traditional jazz and music from the swing period back to the earliest New Orleans stuff. And as I said, my first instrument of choice was the trombone, and I used to play in New Orleans style Dixieland bands. But I got interested in other kinds of music around the advent of Charlie Parker and bebop and stuff. And as much as I liked it, I didn't sort of make that transition in understanding the changing mechanics and mathematics of jazz, starting with that era. But I've always liked it, and in a way, I wish I'd just gone back to university for one year and and pick that up, but instead I chose 35 years of osmosis instead. But I'm starting to get it, and I'm playing with some really fine jazz musicians now, and who are sort of taking me under their wing a little bit, and I really like it. I think I'll be ready to make the Amos Garrett Jazz Musician album in about a year.
Oh, excellent. Your albums have also included some great collaboration projects with the likes of Jeff Moldauer and Doug Sam. These type of projects must be really fulfilling for you as a musician.
They have been, yeah. In fact, I hesitate to say, but I think that probably the three best albums that I've worked on in the last 5 years weren't my albums. I hate that. And one of which would be Jeff Moldauer's last record, which I just love it. Have you heard that? It's called Secret Handshake.
No, I can't say I have.
Oh man, it is an unbelievably good record. It's on Blacktop. No, it's not on Blacktop. What the hell label is that on? It's on High Tone.
Oh yeah,
which is a label out of Oakland, I think, or Berkeley. Mm-hmm. Go to links to get a copy of that album. Jeff basically left the business for about 15 years and got into the computer world and was designing software for a big steel company in Detroit. But he's a player at heart, and that whole era he's been researching and preparing to re-enter the music biz, and he's put a lot of time and effort into this album. It's the greatest thing he's ever done by a long shot. It just floored people over here. Oh. And he's back. And the other two albums, I would say, are the two records I made with Doug Sahm, and who, as you know, regrettably and very surprisingly to me, is no longer with us. And the one was called The Return of the Formerly Brothers, which won a Juno in Canada. That's sort of our Grammy up here. And the other record was a Live in Japan album that was done when we toured Japan with that combination of Doug and myself and Gene Taylor, the great boogie woogie piano player, and I love collaboration records are wonderful because they're easier, and you've got a lot of input from obviously someone that you really want to work with.
You've got quite a following in Japan, I believe. Was that a result of that light album, or?
Oh, I think it's more a result of the fact that a lot of records that I've played on that weren't that popular in other parts of the world developed. I'm no rock star in Japan, but it's more like I have a cult following over there, and mm-hmm. I think starting back around with the early Moldauer albums and Ian and Sylvia and Great Speckled Bird. Ian and Sylvia toured Japan, or at least went and played the World's Fair for about a 1-month run in 1970, and I was with them on that tour. And I think that probably helped establish their popularity in Japan. But just my fans in Japan follow, my career, and they'll buy records that aren't widely distributed. And they'll go out of their way to get hold of these records that I make on tiny little record companies in Canada, et cetera, et cetera.
Now let's talk about your current band. It sounds like a really tight unit. Run through the background of some of the guys.
Yeah, well, my band is currently. I've had this band together for 14 years now, and the personnel has changed a bit as years go by. But currently, my band's made up of a very traditional sort of boogie woogie style piano player named Kelly J, who was in a very popular sort of blues rock band in the 70s in Toronto called Crowbar, and they had one major hit in the States. And Kelly wrote that, a tune called "Oh What a Feeling." And my bass player's from Alberta, where I live, and is an original member of the band named Brian Pollock. And he's from Red Deer, Alberta, which about 80 miles north of Calgary. And my drummer is Tom Moon, who's also a veteran of the Ian and Sylvia. Actually, he worked with Ian Tyson a lot after Ian and Sylvia split up. And he lives in a small town southwest of Calgary, which is where I live, where we live in two different small towns, but pretty close to each other.
Would you say you're more comfortable these days on stage or in the studio?
I haven't made a record of my own for 5 years, and I really should do it. But I keep saying, you better make a record pretty soon, or people are going to forget about you. But I've got 1 million gigs. It's hard to feel guilty about not recording when you're working all the time. But
yeah.
I do have to get back in the studio pretty soon. But I've always preferred live performance to recording.
How is the live music scene in Canada these days? Is it pretty healthy?
It's in certain areas. I mean, it's like Australia. The population centers, the cities are so widely spaced apart, and the economies in Canada, the regional economies, are very different from each other. So at any given time, say the nightclub or concert scene could be really healthy, as it is right now in Alberta, where there's a lot of oil flowing at the moment, and whereas it could be very poor or destitute in the Canadian Maritimes on the East Coast, where it's real poor at the moment, or the West Coast isn't doing great either. And the center to Toronto's, it's big, but Toronto's very, very much more, or the music scene in Toronto is becoming more and more Americanized all the time. It's just, it's intensely competitive, and the nightclubs are all one-nighters. There's no three-nighters, six-night stands anymore there, and the money's horrible. And so, like I say, it varies. You can't look at Canada, and I'm sure you can't look at a music scene in Australia on a national level. You really got to look at it on a regional one.
Yeah. After all these years, do you still find yourself learning things about the guitar?
I'm learning a lot right now. In fact, I've been playing an L5 that is a guitar that I rarely take out of my house, and I'm stringing it with like medium gauge jazz strings, so I basically can't bend strings hardly at all, and I'm not intending to discard all that really radical glissando technique that I invented in the long run. But for now, I'm looking at that as kind of a crutch, and by playing a jazz guitar as strong as a jazz guitar, it's forcing me to learn new things in terms of a new technique in terms of improvisation, and not fall back on stuff that I've had under my thumb for decades anyhow.
And just before we wind up, what would be your major advice for young guitarists on the way up?
Let me see. Wait a sec. That's a great question at this moment, because a friend of mine emailed me this song today, a set of song lyrics, and which goes to the tune of "Swinging on a Star," and I'll sing it to you. Here's my advice. Here's it goes. It goes, what's it going to keep hearing? Here it goes. Let me see. Oh, would you like to play the guitar, carry money home in a jar from a coffee house or a bar? Or would you rather get a job? A job is the thing that makes you get out of bed and work every day until you're dead. Your back is aching and your brain is numb. You just can't wait until the weekend comes. But if you don't want to starve or beg or rob, you're gonna have to get a job. Or would you like to play the guitar, drive for miles and miles in your car, and pretend that you're a big star? Or would you rather book the gig? An agent is the guy who takes his 20%. What he says isn't always what he meant. He'll clean you out in ways you never thought, because he's good at business and he knows you're not. And then he'll sue, and then he'll, let me see, got to change a page. And then he'll sue you if you ever make it big, 'cause he's the guy who booked the gig. Oh, would you like to play the guitar for a living? Hardy har har. I'll admit this is pretty bizarre. Or would you rather be the wife? The wife is the one who has to rescue our butts. She's either a saint or else she's nuts. She gets impatient and she gets annoyed 'cause she's the one who must remain employed. So if you want to wreck your life, become a guitar picker's wife. That's it.
That sounds like it was written by someone with experience, I think.
Yeah, that guy, the guy that wrote that is, I'm just looking up the heading of this email, is Pat Donahue. Pat is a great fingerstyle guitar player. He's a national American fingerstyle champ, and he's the staff guitarist for a wonderful public radio, a national public radio show in the States called Prairie Home Companion.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So that's my advice. Don't take it too seriously.
It answered the question beautifully.
Yes. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Amos. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
Thanks.
Hope we get the chance to see you down here real soon.
Oh, I was there once, and I can't wait to get back.
Well, we'd love to see you.
Okay.
All the best.
Right, all the best to you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.